Ladies, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, and the easiest way is Bounty beef stew or chicken stew. Here we have Bounty beef stew. Are these not the tenderest, leanest chunks of beef you've ever seen? So tastily surrounded by a garden of vegetables. Now, watch what happens when the Bounty beef stew enters the stomach. There you have it, ladies. Living proof that the way to a man's heart is Bounty.
Love you.
First, let's look at the Illinois board for the Senate race, where Senator Dirksen is running for re-election, whereupon we find that NBC News has projected Dirksen to be the winner with 54% of the vote, and so the golden voice of the Senate leader, recording star, has not been stilled, and he will return to the Senate, presumably as majority leader, in January. Now to Texas. In Texas, in the presidential election, Humphrey is still in the lead. He has been in the lead in Texas all night and is holding it now. We have about 25% of the vote in. Humphrey leads with 43. Nixon is second with 38. And Wallace, 19. In Iowa, we have projected Nixon as the winner with 50. He has 56% now. In our projection, that's it. In our projection, we figure he will finish up the evening with 53% of the vote. In Nebraska, Nebraska is Nixon country. We have only 1% of the vote in, and the figures are not yet very large, but by going to the special precincts chosen in advance and bringing them directly here, we have projected Nixon will end the vote count with 61%. Rhode Island, with its 4 electoral votes, we have projected Humphrey the winner. And our calculations show that when all the votes are counted, he will have 65%. That's one of his strongest states. The District of Columbia is, I think, his strongest. 99% of the vote was in from there 2-3 hours ago, and we project Humphrey as the winner with 78%. Chet?
In Pennsylvania, Humphrey's lead is coming from the cities, but not from the city of Philadelphia, where at last word only 10% of the vote has been counted. The reason that Humphrey has moved ahead in the national popular vote is that the votes in the big industrial states, such as New York, Illinois, Michigan, now are being reported on the NBC Elections Board. Humphrey and the Democrats, traditionally, of course, are strong in these states. The NBC News projection desk has learned that in Dallas, something has gone wrong with the computer that counts a substantial number of the votes, and election officials in Dallas now say that these votes cannot be counted until tomorrow. To Ed Newman.
We've had a considerable additional number of House seats settled. The total is now 275, and of the 275, the Democrats have won 154, the Republicans 121. One reason we've had such a sharp jump is that California has begun to come in. As you can see, we project 15 Democrats. We say 15 Democrats have won in California, 13 Republicans. Those are seats in which there was no opposition or only nominal opposition. And we are also projecting that the Democrats will maintain control of the House, because our experts tell us that the Republicans will probably make a total gain of 12 seats, a net gain of 12 seats, leaving the Democrats with a 35 majority in the House of Representatives. That's subject to change, liable to change, of course, but we don't think it's going to change very much. We think the Republicans will gain about 12 seats. Now, in the delegations, in the matter of delegations, the Democrats control 10, the Republicans 2, that being a matter of consequence if the election should go into the House. We have some interesting information on the results in the South, and it looks as though for the southern states, the composition of the House will be pretty much what it has been. In the South, the Democrats have won 62 races. They're leading in 25, total of 87. The Republicans have won 12. They're leading in 16, total of 28. Now, in the current House, there are still a few undecided, of course. In the current House, the Democrats hold 91, the Republicans 28, so you can see that there is really no substantial change in the House. And so far as we can tell, the candidacy of George Wallace has not substantially affected the House races in the South. The House has become, in the last few years, a two-party region, but the Republicans have not pushed it any more their way this year, which is certainly a disappointment for them. Conceivably, black voters turning out to vote against Wallace for the presidency have helped some Southern Democrats in the House races. We're looking into that. We'll be looking more closely at it later on.
Ed Newman.
Now to John Chancellor.
Ed?
Oh, yes, Chet.
Just a moment, if I may. Is it your judgment that the margin between Democrats and Republicans in the House is not going to be sufficiently small that a few unhappy Southern Democrats could be talked into becoming Republicans and therefore give the organization of the House to the GOP?
Well, Chet, on the assumption that the NBC projection experts are as expert as we say they are, the Republicans will gain 12 and the Democrats will have a margin of 35. A margin of 35 would mean that the Republicans would have to pick up 18 Democrats to give them the majority over the Democrats to organize the House. And my impression is that that is something they cannot do, that is too large a margin for them to overcome. I'd be interested to know what David thinks about that.
What I think is they can't do it, Ed. You might occasionally find a Democrat from any part of the country. In fact, I have occasionally found one or two to switch parties. But to find a wholesale switch on the part of 18 members, I think would be nearly impossible.
I think it probably is, but I think perhaps we should consider the possibility that the closeness of the presidential race and the possibility that the contest will go into the House may have some effect on the organization of the House also. It's just one of those unpredictable contingencies, I think. I think I was to say now to John Chancellor.
What did your machine tell you now, John?
Well, the machine and I want to be in agreement with what Ed Newman has been saying about Wallace having very little effect on House races. He's not having much of an effect outside the South. By our calculations now in the Middle West, Humphrey and Nixon are about even. And Wallace is down around 10%, roughly, of the vote, which is quite low. In Indiana, for example, where George Wallace ran so well in primary contests in Lake County around Gary and with the steel mills, his statewide total is holding around 10 or 12%, which is really very low. In the East, Humphrey is just slightly ahead of Nixon at this point, and Wallace is down around 8 or 10% in the East. That's his poorest region. And then we turn to the South, where George Wallace is getting about 30% of the vote, where Nixon is just a little bit ahead of that, and Humphrey is about even with that. So that when we look at George Wallace's figure of 18% nationally, most of that is based on the fact that he is, even with Hubert Humphrey, a little behind Richard Nixon in the South and doing very, very badly everywhere else in the country. We've been trying to figure out if he's hurting Richard Nixon among suburban and rural voters, and although it's early to make anything really solid about this, he may be doing so in Ohio, he may have done so in Kentucky, but in a lot of other states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Jersey, Tennessee, Indiana, we don't really have an indication that among suburbanites who registered great alarm about the law and order issue, that George Wallace is prevailing this evening. Back in a moment.
All right, now let's see if we can find first. No, that's not it. No, believe me, it's in there somewhere.
No matter how rough you treat a rebel, it's awfully hard to hurt it. A survey of professional driving schools shows that they use more of our cars than any other kind.
How am I doing? A lot better than yesterday. Turn left.
I can't do it while you're watching me.
Okay, turn left. Here. How does it feel the first time out in traffic, Mr. Moss? Mr. Moss? Mr. Moss? Look out for the truck!
What truck?
Behind the bus!
What bus?
The Rebel has held its own against some of the worst drivers in the world.
Should I turn the windshield wiper on?
At this point, it looks like the Rebels are going to outlast the teachers.
To the popular vote board, 28% of the national vote is now registered. Humphrey is in the lead with 42%, Nixon with 41%. Humphrey's lead is now 224,000. Wallace dropping one more percentage point to 17%. To the electoral board, Nixon has command of 18 states with 134 electoral votes. Humphrey has taken 9 with 114. Wallace can claim 5 with a total of 45, and 245 very important electoral votes are still in contest. In the state of New Jersey, 45% of that vote is in, and the percentage figures have stayed fast ever since the first returns came in. Nixon leading with 48%, Humphrey with 43%. In Pennsylvania, the vote there is mounting. 38% of that vote is now in. Shows Humphrey with a substantial lead, 1,005,000, or 50% of the vote. Nixon with 42%. Ohio, 36% of the vote counted. Nixon has now taken a slight lead in the state of Ohio with 45%. Humphrey immediately behind by about 14,000 votes with 44%. Wallace with 11. Kansas, we have a projected winner in Kansas, Nixon, with 52% of the final vote. Kentucky, a projected winner in Kentucky. 94% of the vote is counted. NBC News projected this one several hours ago, and our projection is that Nixon can claim Kentucky with 43% of the vote. And a new one, state of Idaho, 1% of the vote is in, but nevertheless, from our pre-selected precincts, from whom we have heard, it is our judgment or our projection that Nixon will take 56% of the Idaho vote. To Sander Van Oker.
Chet, as David mentioned a moment ago, NBC News has projected Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen the winner in the state of Illinois. Over State Attorney General William Clark, we are projecting Everett Dirksen will regain his Senate seat with 54% of the vote. Clark was a dove on Vietnam, a supporter of Senator McGovern. That probably doesn't hold much ice in that contest. It would be very difficult to beat Senator Dirksen no matter what you were standing for. He is getting to be an institution in the state of Illinois. But it does raise some questions about how other opponents of the war have done throughout the country. As we mentioned earlier, Senator Fulbright, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, has been declared the projected winner in Arkansas. And as I think we mentioned earlier, too, that Oliver Quayle took a poll there and found that that state is about one of the most hawk-like states in the country. Yet a lot of people didn't care much what Senator Fulbright said on Vietnam. They liked the idea that he was against President Johnson, it was said. In Connecticut, Senator Ribicoff, also a dove on Vietnam, he won there tonight over Congressman Ed May. But in Pennsylvania, Senator Joe Clark, another early opponent of the war, he lost to Congressman Richard Schweiker. However, it's complex here because Schweiker and Clark had rather similar views on Vietnam, and one couldn't say this was a hawk versus dove contest in that state. In Wisconsin, the differences were very, very much more pronounced, with Gaylord Nelson, one of the earliest opponents of the Vietnam War, being attacked for his position on the war by state legislator Jarris Leonard. Apparently, Nelson, who I must say did not mention the war and his stand on it very much, did not suffer because of his earlier opposition to the war. But it gets complex in the state of Ohio, where right now John Gilligan, who fought for the minority, or Dove Plank, at the Democratic Convention, trails William Saxby. But there are a lot of complex reasons here. Labor cut Gilligan, it's felt, because it was felt his views on Vietnam were too extreme. And in South Dakota, we now have Senator McGovern ahead. He was another opponent of the war, but that one is too early. So, again, one cannot have any feeling except this, that apparently opposition to the war on Vietnam didn't hurt many people in senatorial contest thus far. And we'll be back in a moment.
Milk is homogenized to ensure uniform consistency in every drop. And guess who homogenized a bleach? Miracle White. This new non-chlorine powdered bleach is homogenized to ensure consistency through every box for every wash. Homogenized so every tiny blue grain carries full bleaching power to be safe and effective for even colored fabrics. Safe and effective for all the Miracle fabrics. Spandex, wash and wears, fiberglass, stretchables, permanent press. Miracle White's non-chlorine bleach is made to keep all Miracle fabrics brand new bright. And how comforting that it's equally safe and effective for all washables, linens, baby things, anything you want to get really clean. Who but Miracle White would think of homogenizing a non-chlorine bleach to be effective and safe, and double guarantee satisfaction?
The vote count continues to pile up in some of our governor's races. I'd like to bring you the returns now from Arkansas. We haven't had a report on that recently. 12% of the vote is in. Almost all of it is from Little Rock. And Republican Winthrop Rockefeller is getting 57% of it. The Democrat Marion Crank's 43%. Prison reform has been a big issue in this campaign. Rockefeller defending it, Crank saying it cost too much. Another issue was the fact, and Crank admitted it, that he had members of his family on his payroll while he was a member of the state legislature, wife, son, 3 daughters. One daughter was only 8 years old and was drawing $20 a day as a clerk. And Crank said that was all right, that he thought she'd learned a lot about government. In New Mexico, where 17% of the vote has been tallied, most of it from Albuquerque, the Republican, Dave Cargo, is trailing his Democratic opponent, Fabian Chavez, 47% to 53%. We spoke with the governor's headquarters a little while ago, and they said they expected returns from the eastern part of the state to come to their rescue. And in North Carolina, we have projected, NBC News has projected another winner in the governor's race. Democrat Robert Scott, we say, will take the race from Republican James Gardner. He's getting 55% of the vote right now. We say that his tally will eventually come to about 54% of the vote when all is said and done. Gardner tied his campaign in very strongly to Governor Wallace's, but apparently it didn't do him too much good. Here is David.
Thank you. On our board showing the popular vote, Hubert Humphrey is still ahead, but barely. Each now has roughly 41%. Humphrey has a lead of slightly more than 100,000 votes. 41%, 41%, and 17. On the electoral vote tabulation, there's the result as it stands at the moment, based on NBC's projections. Still, no one close to having 270, or enough to be elected president. That's where we stand at the moment.
It's often said that the House of Representatives is the most sensitive to shifts in popular feeling, political feeling in the country. Well, consider this. We have on our board 50 states listed, and only one of them at this moment can show a change in any seat in the House of Representatives. That's Connecticut. In Connecticut, the Democrats have lost 1 seat to the Republicans, and of the 276 seats so far decided in the House of Representatives, just 1 has changed hands. So at the moment, the Democrats have 154, the Republicans 122. A majority of 218 is needed. We believe that the Republicans are going to gain 12 seats, give or take 1 or 2. If that happens, it will leave the Democrats in control with 235 to the Republicans' 200, and the possibility that the Republicans could gain any Democratic allies, perhaps in the South, sufficient to enable them to control the House, seems to us to be extremely remote. Now, if the presidential election should go into the House, which is a possibility, then the matter of who controls state delegations is of importance, and at the moment the Democrats control 10, the Republicans 2. Some of those Democratic delegations perhaps would be Wallace delegations. That remains to be seen if the election actually goes into the House. Now to Sander Van Oken.
Here are some further returns on close Senate contests in the state of Iowa. In the contest there between Governor Harold Hughes, the popular three-term governor, and state legislator David Stanley, who has literally crisscrossed the state since last spring. The contest is narrowing now after Stanley enjoyed a larger lead earlier in the evening. This must mean that the returns from Des Moines, where Hughes is supposed to be very strong, are now coming in. That's, as I said, I think earlier in the evening, the only state where Vietnam is a clear-cut, debatable issue between the two candidates, in fact, the only issue. In the state of Idaho, NBC News now projects that Senator Frank Church, who is seeking his third term, will be the winner over Congressman George Hansen, and Church will win with 56% of the vote. Congressman Hansen was a much more conservative candidate than Frank Church, and we are projecting Church's victory with 56% of the vote. In South Dakota, where a friend of Church's is running for a second term, George McGovern, not enough of the vote is in yet to make any decisive judgment one way or the other. It's too early to tell. But it shows George McGovern leading former Governor Archie Gubrud by about 12 percentage points. Now to Frank McGee.
In North Carolina, where we have projected a winner, both candidates for governor pictured themselves as conservatives, and neither campaigned for the Negro vote. Nevertheless, virtually the entire Negro vote has gone to the Democratic Lieutenant Governor Robert Scott. By contrast, Scott's opponent, Republican James Gardner, received a majority of the white vote, so that the Negro vote for Scott appears to have been the decisive factor in his behalf. Gardner alienated the black vote by running his campaign closely along Wallace lines, and Wallace is running very strong in North Carolina. But it appears that enough of those Wallace voters have cast their traditional Democratic votes for other officers, at any rate, to give Democrat Robert Scott his edge. And we'll be back in a moment.